Okay, so this is me. I'm going to be talking about building large-scale developer communities from scratch for my keynote session. Just like I have been introduced, I do a lot of communities, especially across the African continent. I am the founder of She Could Africa. She Could Africa is a non-profit organization for women in technology in Africa. I am also the co-founder of Open Source Community Africa, which is also a community for open source enthusiasts, experts, and everyone in between. Just like mentioned earlier, I'm also the community manager for Sub-Saharan Africa Google. What this means is that I help Google build and manage its Google Developer Groups programs, that's the GDG program, and the Women Tech Maker Ambassador programs across Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, over the course of time, I've been fortunate enough to also, find other initiatives that are focused on developer relations. I'm a huge fan of DevRel and fully focused on everything DevRel. So one of my ways of giving back to the community is to also run something called DevRel Light, helping newbies and everyone interested in getting a career in developer relations. And every now and then, I also identify as a technical writer and a tech content creator. So like I mentioned earlier, my talk is going to be focused on building communities, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this is, aside from all of the things that I do across the different communities and programs that I run, communities have, proven to now become a very vital part of the developer ecosystem, and more communities are being brought up or are being realized or, founded every new day or every single day. So the areas of this my talk is going to focus on fundamentals of community, goal and vision setting, milestones, team, network courage, and diversity and inclusion. Because you cannot build a large scale community without putting into mind the aspect of diversity and inclusiveness in your community activities. Now, the average person would wonder, why is this talk important to me? Why should I focus on this talk? Aside from people who primarily benefit from community aspects, who are, in this instance, we're looking at developers. There are also people who benefit from community activities as third parties or third party stakeholders. Have people like founders who are running organizations. We have people at C-level, executive level. We have CTOs, CMOs, and co. And we also have people in other fields that are beneficiaries of community programs. So in one way or the other, this also ties down to your role. As long as you're involved in the tech ecosystem, this also ties down to your role. The first thing first, why should I be interested in building a developer community, or why should my company be interested in building a developer community? I have a couple of points that I put down here. The first that I have highlighted here is to provide a primary essence and support system around product, dev tool, or field. Products in the sense that you could be running a developer product, and your community program for that product will provide a primary essence and help people better understand how to utilize your products, or just create a support system for them beyond just what we know as customer care. It also does the same thing for dev tools and fields. A lot of times we see a lot of communities springing up around different fields in tech. An example is what I do with Open Source Community Africa, in other words, Oscar. I'll be using the word Oscar for a large part of my talk today. A large part of what I do is for Oscar, it's focused on open source. Open source is a field. What we're helping people do is we're helping people get together within the African ecosystem, as long as you identify as someone in tech, and as an African in Africa in tech interested in open source. We have created a community around that field. Another thing is it helps simplify developer market penetration. Many of us might know that the developer market is quite different from the normal or the average market out there, meaning that it can be a little bit more difficult while trying to drive usage and adoption of your developer tool and products. Having developer communities around you helps simplify this market penetration. In other words, it's easier for you to have developers embrace your product when there's a community around, because that community is going to be showing support. A large example is how, let's use a platform like Stack Overflow, has been able to provide support with people providing answers, having the ability to ask questions and things like that. It has created some sort of community where you can always go to get responses or answers to anything as regards tech. Another thing is that it creates a talent pipeline, which boils down to the first thing I said earlier as to why this talk involves everyone and involves every role. It creates a talent pipeline in the sense that the people who are part of these communities are, aside from the fact that they identify as your users or they identify as your members, they also have a career of their own in the sense that some of them might be back-end engineers, they might be front-end engineers, they might be designers, they might be product managers, whatever it is. And having that community helps create that talent pool or pipeline for your program, for your community, for your organization, to create some sort of pipeline from community into full-time career. Then the last one is building communities help help growth in your career. And sometimes it also brings out spotlight or gives you the opportunity to get that spotlight. I'll use myself as a big example for this. What I do with the different communities, a large chunk of everything that I do. And the reason why I'm here today is because of the communities that I've been involved with from day one. Even up until my role at Google, all of the things that I've been able to do is because of the activities that I have put up in these different communities that have been able to speak for me. So running communities, also helps in your career growth, or even being a part of it also helps in your career growth, and it gives you a spotlight opportunity because it places you as a thought leader within your ecosystem as well. So first of all, I'll start with fundamentals of community. There are a couple of things that you need to understand. Okay, now I have decided to build a community around my developer product or around a particular field or around a particular tool. What are the things that I need to do? The first thing you need to look out for is creating a naming or a definition system for your community. It's like having a newborn baby. At some point, you're going to have to name your baby just so that in terms of identity, it's easy for people to identify with that community, or in this example, with that baby or with that person. So you need to create a name and definition for your community. This kind of sets the primary foundation for every other thing that your community is going to be involved with. It's many times it's not a thing cast in stone if you're not fully sure in the sense that you want to revamp the naming later on. But the very first thing you need to look at is creating a naming or definition system for your community. And the second thing is also to be able to create goal and values. The goal and values for me, for anybody who has worked directly with me or who has reached out to me for advice on community building and things like that, I like to amplify on goals and values because that creates the primary foundation for everything that you're doing within your community, in the sense that your goal creates that invisible boundary as to this is what this community is focused on. These are the values that this community is focused on. And why do I say this? I'm going to amplify on this later on my talk. But just to address this here, why do you have to place a lot of focus on your goals and values? Because in community, there's a lot of elements being thrown around. Community building is a lot of trial and error. And a lot of times, the voice of your community members directs the growth part of your community, meaning that many times you'll have people who don't primarily identify with what you're doing try to suggest things. People are bringing up suggestions, people are bringing in feedback. There's so many moving elements, and sometimes it can get so confusing and so frustrating to the point where you're making changes here and there, and then after a while it doesn't really identify with the primary reason why you started that community, which is why your goals and value need to be defined right from start, so you know that these are the boundaries that I can I can't go beyond, and these are the things that this community is focused on. The next thing you need to define is a primary audience. I'm putting primary there because when it comes to community building, you have multiple audience. You have primary, you have secondary, and you have tertiary audience. The primary audience are the people that your community activities or whatever it is they do in your community directly affects. In this instance, for Open Source Community Africa and what I do at Chico Africa, our community members, our primary audience are direct community members. I'll use Oscar in for a better example. Our primary audience are people who are interested in open source, people who are already into open source contribution or development, and then people who are, yeah, so those two experts in it are people who they sorry for secondary and tertiary audiences are people who do not necessarily identify as members of your community or participants in your community or stakeholders in your communities, but are affected by the actions of your primary audience. So you need to also be able to define your primary audience. And the last thing is you need to be able to define your platform or create your platform. Platforms, sometimes people think that platform doesn't really affect what happens in your community or the type of activities that you run in your community or in general everything about your community, but it plays a huge role. There are some fields, there are some tools, there are some products where when you're trying to create communities, there are certain platforms that are much more convenient for it because that's what is more popular and that's what people are primarily used to. For example, when it comes to say I want to start a community around an NFT project, the primary platform that I want to use is a Discord platform because that's much more common and popular within the crypto space and the NFT space as well. Unlike, say, I want to start a community on maybe a particular field, say cloud engineering, just a random field, I might decide to want to use Slack because that's more career focused. And when it comes to career focused platforms, a lot of people tilt towards Slack as well. So your platform determines a lot of things, and these are the four basic things that I like to set as fundamentals when you're trying to build a developer community. In this instance, we're going to be focusing on building large scale developer communities, but these are just the primary things that you need to set up whenever you want to run a community or build a community, regardless of if you want it to be large scale or small scale. So the next thing now, after setting up your fundamentals and really understanding what your fundamentals of community should be, the next thing you want to do is your goal and vision. So goals and vision basically help you define your audience. I mentioned this earlier. It also helps you define your impact boundaries. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Impact boundaries, I use this word because in the sense that the people that directly affect or that are directly impacted by what you do within your community, you need to be able to set a boundary. So, for example, you want to run a community of cloud engineering, a cloud engineering community, and just people who are focused on cloud engineering, and say somebody who is focused on design decides to join your community because it's a tech community. If you're not able to define your impact boundary, it means that you might at some point go beyond focusing on cloud engineering related activities, programs, initiatives, and try to also accommodate the needs of those who are the designers or who identify as designers and are not there because of cloud engineering. So creating that your impact boundary, your goals and vision help you define your impact boundary and say, "Oh, this community is for cloud engineers or people who are into cloud engineering, and that's everything I'm going to be focused on." That way, when other people try to join your community, you're able to tell them, "Well, sorry, but this may not be the right community fit for you." Then the next thing is it helps you understand your community wants and needs. I think that this is quite explanatory, but I will try to do a little bit more justice to it. Community wants and needs in the sense that, like the example I gave earlier, when somebody else tries to join your community or someone else tries to join your program or your activity, basically your community, you're able to, understand that this is not what they need, and these are things that actually works for the people who are part of your community. So to set your goals and vision, the questions that you need to ask, I have categorized them into a couple of more questions. The who. This is when trying to define this, things that you need to define, trying to define this, you're looking at who are the beneficiaries. So keyword beneficiaries or people you're going to be impacting your program. Who are the primary beneficiaries of this community? Say you're running a community around a product, maybe an API tool, and you want people to developers to be able to utilize this. Who are the primary beneficiaries of this product? That in this instance, it would be developers, backend developers specifically, people who are going to be able to integrate that API into their products. What do they do? What gender, what race, etc. do they identify as? When you're able to define all of this, it helps you really understand how best to cater the needs of that community towards the goal of the community as well. The next thing you need to be able to define is the what part. What am I trying to achieve? Do I have a max capacity? I would give an example of for Chico Africa. When I started out She Code Africa, I knew that the who part for me beneficiaries are basically women who identify as Africans in Africa and identify as women in tech. Those are the two things for me. What do they do? As long as they were in tech, as long as they were in technical fields in tech, then they are okay to be beneficiaries of this community that's She Code Africa. What gender? It was basically going to focus on women. What race? African, so primarily black and etc. In the what part, what am I trying to achieve? What am I trying to achieve with Shikode Africa? We're trying to make sure that we're creating that as much diversity and bringing in as much gender inclusiveness in the tech African tech ecosystem. Do I have a max capacity? While starting at Shikode Africa, this was not a primary thought of mine, but this is something that over the course of time I've been able to know this is something that needs to be defined for anybody else who's starting out a community. So, do I have a max capacity in the sense that while running a community, do I want it to be max of maybe 1,000 people, 10,000 people? This is a actually a very vital question if you're really, really interested in or really, really looking to building large scale developer communities. And by large scale, I mean from 1,000 members up and above. The other thing that you need to be able to define is the where. This is something that not everyone puts into consideration, especially if your community is a global type of community. An example is the GDG program. Although GDG program is also broken down into different regions. By GDG, I mean Google Developer Groups. It's also broken down into different regions. But yes, the where location plays an important part in how your audience assimilates your activity and your community. What works for the African continent might not necessarily work for the European continent. What works for person A in XYZ region might not work for person B in ABC region. So all of these things play a huge part and a huge role in trying to define and build a developer community. And then, like I mentioned earlier about community platform, this also determines the level of interest and participation. So, for example, with the example I gave earlier on, where an NFT project and a cloud engineering program on Slack and this on Discord, if you try to interchange that, you might not get much success because those are two, you're switching platforms that already work for each of these sectors into the other one and you're trying to experiment. Even though, yes, I know that community building takes in a lot of experiments, but a lot of times it might not be worth it if people have already carried out that experiment and have been able to define what works and what doesn't work anymore. And the last thing you need to be able to define is the why. Why am I doing this? Why are we trying to build a developer community around our tool? Why am I trying to build a developer community for this particular field? What exactly is the reason? Because just like every career in tech, you need to be able to define your reason. You need to be able to every now and then draw yourself back to the reason why you started this at the first place. For me, for Open Source Community Africa, the reason myself and my co-founder decided to start this is because we looked around and noticed that there wasn't an active community of open source enthusiasts, developers, or experts or contributors within the African ecosystem. And so we decided to start one. And for She Code Africa, the reason why I decided to start that was because I wasn't seeing as much diversity as I was surrounded with at the bigger places. So I needed to create a community and a platform that would be able to build these girls up to the point where there are global places and spaces where they're able to showcase their talents. So you need to be able to have a reason behind your motive. For companies running developer communities around their products, your reason could be, oh, you're trying to get more users, you're trying to onboard more users, you're trying to get more number of integrations on your products and things like that. The reasons are entirely different for different people, but you need to be able to have a reason why. I've seen companies also make a mistake on this where they just started developer community for the sake of starting it because it's something that they see as now rampant, and then after 2 months, 3 months, that community dies because there's no sustainability structure around it. Then the other question is, can I make it sustainable? This is also a very vital question. When people talk about sustainability, they think about, oh, funding. Are we able to sustain this with money? But it goes beyond just funding. It goes. You're also looking at things around the people running that community. You're looking at the interest from the community. You're looking at the users or the members of that community as well. Is this something that's sustainable? Say, for example, you're very specific about the niche, the gender, the race, and different metrics. you're very specific about them. Do you think that this is sustainable for the next 2 to 3 years? Because for large scale developer communities, you don't plan for 2 months, 3 months. What you plan for is year long plans for sustainability. So you need to think about all of these things beyond funding, even though funding is like 50 to 40%. When it comes to priority list, it's a top priority because you need to have money to be able to run a lot of the activities that you run. But like I said, sustainability goes beyond just funding. So you need to be able to ask yourself, is it possible to make this sustainable? What do I need to be able to make this sustainable? Then the next thing you need to look at is milestones. This is something that we were able to define while starting at Oscar and Chico Africa. So basically, what are milestones? Milestones are metrics that help you determine the growth curve of your community, in the sense that there are different items that help your pointers that help you say, okay, I have gotten to this level. That I think that we are at sea level when it comes to our community building. We have achieved a certain criteria, a certain landmark, and things like that. So for us at Chico Africa, the first milestone we had was being able to train 1,000 women, because it ties down with our goal at what we're trying to do with Chico Africa. Your milestone could be being able to onboard your first user. Your milestone could be having at least 10 to 15 members of your community be able to say that they have moved from point A to point B as regards their growth curve. That's upward movement. Your milestone could be saying that XYZ have been able to get so and so working opportunities from your talent pipeline. Milestones are entirely different and unique to different communities. But basically, there are metrics that would help you determine the growth curve of your community, in the sense that your growth curve could be upward, it could be downwards, meaning it could be positive, it could be negative, it could be either going backwards or forward. But these are metrics that would really help you. And a lot of times, for me, an advice and tip that I like to give is when setting these metrics, don't set metrics that are easily achievable. And while you're doing that, also do it in a year long plan. Sometimes it could be in short term, it could be short term metrics, it could be long term metrics. However, it's entirely up to you. An example of milestones that people like to use, and I personally also like to use, is numbers. Say, for example, trained 1,000 women, had 1,000 participants participate in our Hacktoberfest program, etc. Data is a huge thing when it comes to community and when it comes to milestone setting. Another thing is could be your success stories, in the sense that how are you able to tell success stories of your members? Have you gotten any success story from your community since you started? What's that success story? Your success story could be like, okay, for my milestone, my first success story that I want as a milestone would be when somebody gets a new job from our community. It's entirely up to you. The other would be product or platform integration, just like I mentioned earlier. It could still be related to numbers, it may not be related to numbers. The other one is conversion, in the sense that how many people were you able to take from point A to point B? This can be how many people was I able to take from either a community event by speaking to them and onboarding them into being members of that community or users of that community. How many people moved from being junior developers to being senior developers just in this community? Conversion also kind of tallies down with success stories, but there's a thin, fine line difference between both of them as well. So conversion can be in talent, it can be in awareness. Awareness in the sense that how many people have moved from being members of the community to being advocates of your community, in the sense that word of mouth advocates. You're not spending so much on social media publicity and all of those things about your community, but people are able to advocate for you. This is a milestone for me that we prioritize both at SCA, that She Code Africa, and Open Source Community Africa. So there's so many milestone examples, but these are just some that I like to use, and a lot of communities that I have worked with as well like to use. So next thing now is team. I think that this is quite self-explanatory. When you're running a community, you can't do it alone, because it beats the idea of what community means. You need a team of people, and a healthy community. One thing people don't know that is that a healthy community, when you say a healthy or thriving community, means that there are a lot of people or a number of people who have put in extra effort behind the scenes just to keep that running. Community building is harder to thrive as a lone ranger. You need individuals who are committed to the goals and vision of that community. This is very, very primary because community building, especially for large scale developer communities, it's a long term thing. And if you don't have people who are primarily committed to the goal and vision of that community, it's easy for them to fall by the roadside or along the way. They could tell you, oh, priorities have changed. If you don't have people who genuinely believe in what you're trying to do with that community, it's very difficult to have them build for long term. You also need to have people who understand the essence of teamwork. Now, one thing that I want to say on this is, sorry, okay. So one thing I want to say on this is, while trying to start or create a team for your community, it doesn't have to be a paid role. If you can afford a paid role, that's fine. If you can't afford a paid role, there are lots of people out there who are still committed to building long-term communities just based on being volunteers. For She Code Africa and Open Source Community Africa, we've been able to create very active, fully functional teams of full, I won't really call them full-time volunteers, but all volunteers. Everyone on the team are all volunteers. I also identify as a volunteer for both She Code Africa and Open Source Community Africa. But we've been able to run each of them. For She Code Africa has been running for 6 years with the same team. For Open Source Community Africa has been running for about 3-4 years with the same team as well. Because these are people who are committed to the goal and vision of what we're doing. They also see it as their own child project or their baby child project as well. And they also understand the essence of teamwork, because you can't necessarily lead a team, or you can't necessarily work in a team where nobody understands the essence of teamwork. Everyone wants to identify as an individual, and you can't have um, different people leading different roles and failing to communicate. Communication is a huge thing when it comes to building communities. And then lastly, you need to be able to consider that they need to be willing to take ownership of their roles. As much as, yes, they're all volunteers, when it comes to building large scale developer communities, a lot of elements, like I mentioned earlier, there are lots of moving elements, and you need to have people who are able to take ownership of their roles, stay in charge of things, but also understand the idea of teamwork. Then for network or reach, this is also another thing that you need to be able to consider. To reach a large network of people on your program, it is very, very vital to either evaluate or reevaluate this. Remember, this talk goes beyond just building developer communities, but building large scale developer communities. In Africa, we are very fortunate enough to have communities that have started from scratch and grown into some of the largest communities. I myself personally, aside from what I do at Google, at She Code Africa, at Open Source Community Africa, I have been very fortunate enough to be at the forefront of leading a lot of these large developer communities. I was there when it started from 0 members into now having over 5,000, 25,000, 30,000 members for these different communities. So to reach a large network of people on your program, you need to be able to evaluate or reevaluate these things. What's the number of people we want to get across to? Do you have a cap which boils down to what I explained earlier? Is there a maximum capacity to the number of community members you need in your community? This is something you need to really, really consider, because that would also now help you figure out when it comes to the events and activities that you need to hold within your community as well, or initiatives. When you figure out the number, how do you intend to reach them? Now, these things that I'm highlighting in black are things that I want you to focus on. Number of people. How do we plan to reach them? How do you plan to engage them? Do you have self events, or do you want to reach your community based off of sponsoring other events? Do you have a particular format for reaching your community, or reaching the people, or the number of people you want to get in your community? Say, for example, you want to have a community of 10,000 people. How do you plan to get that 10,000 number? Do you want to do it just by, a standalone community doing your thing? Do you want to integrate with other communities, maybe from their events, activities? Sometimes I see a lot of companies trying to build developer communities, focus more on sponsorship, but there's really no structure around the actual community. Because sponsorships and events only help you provide a platform to gather people together. But what happens after that event? Do you have a follow-up platform, follow-up format? Do you have an onboarding format to convert these people from being attendees into being community members? These are things that you need to consider under your reach. How do you plan to reach these community members and that goal of the number of people that you want? Are you deliberate about grassroots options, that's underserved locations? Another mistake that a lot of people and companies make when trying to build out developer communities is that they focus on the central areas: San Francisco, Lagos, Nairobi, South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa, etc. These central places, and they just focus their attendees on there. But a lot of time, thanks to availability of internet, a lot of time you notice that your members are people who are beyond this location. So how are you being deliberate about reaching people in these grassroots locations? Because number is number regardless of whatever location it is they're coming from, except your program or your community is directly focused on um, having their primary audience as people from a specific location. If you're trying to build global communities like what we're doing, then you need to be very, very deliberate about grassroots options. How are you reaching these people in underserved locations as well? Then the last thing is, how do you continuously amplify on awareness? While building communities, it's 100% non-stop awareness. You have to keep talking about your community. You have to keep amplifying about what your community is about, because a community is almost like a tunnel. People will keep going in and coming out. It's non-stop, meaning that you can't get to a particular point and say, you know what, we are done with amplifying what we're doing about this community. We have the popularity, we have the platform. We're just going to relax. There's no relaxing when it comes to building large-scale developer communities, unfortunately. So you need to be very conscious about constantly amplifying on awareness while you're doing 50% of the work. Now, I'm very specific about this 50% of the work. Why did I put 50% of the work? You want to get your community to a point where people are doing more of the work for you by advocating for you. An example is the Stack Overflow developer community. I don't know much about what it takes to run the community internally, but if you're a developer, regardless of what country, what continent you're in, you definitely know about Stack Overflow community. It has gotten to the point where day in, day night, there are people constantly talking about that community. You want to get your community to that point where you don't have to run ads, except it's very, very vital. You don't have to do so much work. One tweet could go a long way because there's so many people who are constantly talking about what you're doing with that tweet. It's different when you are much more focused on running ads than people doing the word of mouth advocacy for you. So, how do you continuously amplify on awareness? Do you have local chapters? Does your program afford you the opportunity to have local chapters who probably implement what you're doing on a global scale in a much more smaller scale? That leads to awareness as well. Do you have an ambassador or advocacy program? Basically, what you should be looking at is, how am I able to get people to start talking on behalf of my community or speaking on behalf of my community for us beyond where we are? For Shikod Africa and Oscar, one thing that we have prioritized for this is that we have started local chapters, because we know that we're not able to reach as many people as we want to, as goal of our community would want to, just by doing what we do at a global scale. So we have set up local chapters in specific locations that we know that there's an interest of open source in that location, but distance is an issue. And it's the same thing with ambassador advocacy programs. Does your community run ambassador programs? Do you have brand ambassadors who are talking technical brand ambassadors? Do you have advocates? It goes beyond just developer advocates. Do you have community advocates who are speaking on behalf of? They could all be volunteers as well. Maybe thank them with like a token or something, or a stipend. But these are all volunteers who are not under your pay, who are being able to amplify on what you're doing with your community. Then diversity and inclusion. You really cannot want to build a large scale developer community and not think of diversity, because there's no way that's not going to create an issue later on, in the sense that if you're building a large scale developer community, you have to be very conscious about gender diversity, race diversity, language diversity, because you're going to be having people from most likely all across the globe, or if it's focused on a continent, from all across that continent, if you're intentional about it. So diversity is something that you really need to consider, because it helps with innovation and growth. When there's diversity at the table, there's diversity in thoughts, there's diversity in actions. You're getting feedback from numerous people, and it's yielding innovation. Not all feedback, yes, would be accepted, but it helps you see things from a different perspective, and it helps you feel the pain as well from a different perspective. It also provides inclusive actions and decisions, because you're coming together as one, you're being very, very keen in implementing the feedback that a specific set of people tell you as well, then it fosters a sustainable and open community. I think that's self-explanatory. And then at the heart of it all, there's a certain joy and pride that rests on your face, knowing that your community played a vital role in someone's growth. That's literally, for me, the primary essence and beauty of developer communities. Knowing that out there, one person has benefited from what you're doing with your community. Could be in terms of talent or hiring or job change or career change. It could be in the sense that maybe your tool has helped someone solve a particular issue that they have been focused on for a very long time. At the end of the day, is knowing that at least one person out there is benefiting from the efforts that you're putting into your community. So thank you all very much. I have come to the end of my talk. I'm open to questions if there are any, but you can also reach out to me on any of the social platforms at Kolokodes, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Ada Nduka Oyom. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. Let's wait a couple moments to see if anybody has questions in the chat. In the meantime, I would like to ask you a question about building communities. So it's like you've been building communities across Africa. Like, have you had to deal with sort of not just in person, like talking with each other, but also, I'm sure there's also a lot of online Zoom online communication as well, right? So I was
Yeah.
just wondering, do you have any like tips for that? Because I think sometimes it's very hard to engage when it's virtual. And in fact, like our PyData Global conference is definitely one of the things where like we tried very, very hard to make it a bit more engaging, right? Thanks.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is when it comes to virtual communities, well, all communities are going to have virtual platforms, except when it's something like in-person meetings or things like that. You need to be very specific. If a lot of activities are going to be happening on or virtually rather, you need to be very specific about the platform, which is one of the things that I talked about earlier. If you know that within that region, say for example, you have already started implementing your platform as Slack, and you know that within that region, maybe there's a much more popular platform that people are very more focused on. I'll use Africa as an example. In Africa, for texts and social media platforms, it's WhatsApp that is a lot more common here. So it's very common to see WhatsApp groups for smaller group communications. So in this instance, when you notice that there's a drop in participation or activity, you can try to move depending on the number of community members that you have. I know that WhatsApp has a limit, but you can try to move those communities to the smaller platforms. Another thing is for virtual communities, virtual activities, you need to be very, very clear on not, feeding them with too many activities, because that can get very overwhelming, and you have that virtual event fatigue. So you want to limit the number of engaging activities that they have online to maybe activities that would give them time to respond at their own convenience, or maybe do other activities that don't involve one-on-one meetings or video calls or call meetings and things like that. Those are things that I know that has worked and they continue to work for some of these community platforms that I built for. I can see a question on the comment section. Do I go ahead with it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so there's a question on any suggestions for engaging and retaining volunteers. For engaging and retaining volunteers, one thing I would say is you need to, just the same way you're continuously advocating about your community externally, for your volunteers, you need to be able to re-emphasize about why you're doing that, why you're building your community, what you're doing with your community. You need to be, because for volunteers, as long as there's no pay, at some point, every now and then, the morale is definitely going to be low, and you need to be able to, they need to feed off your energy, either as a community lead or as a team lead or as a founder, if you're the founder of a community. So doing that, you need to have, aside team bonding activities, you also need to have sessions or activities where if it's possible for them to meet in person, you don't have to spend a lot of money for that. It could just be a hangout. Another thing is you could have sessions that's focused on their own career growth. Because at the end of the day, what happens is if you're not focused on their own growth, what these volunteers would see is that they're putting in time and effort to they're putting time and efforts to help other people, but they are not benefiting from that community as well. So you need to be more intentional about making sure that they are also benefiting from that community because they are volunteering their time. So you could have expert sessions where you just for all the volunteers bring in an expert to come talk to them about a particular field. Another thing is if you can, provide stipends, provide swag packs, provide discounts, whatever it is that you can. And in summary, just think of other ways that if you were a volunteer, how would you want to benefit from that program that you're volunteering from beyond, just having people's success story to keep inspiring you. So I hope that answers that question. Thank you, Rashima. Okay, so I think I will be leaving the stage now. Thank you so much, everyone. Please remember you can reach out to me if you have questions, commentaries, whatsoever it is. Okay, I see that there's still a question. Okay, one more question. You talked about tracking metrics. Could you share some metrics or success cases for SCA and Oscar? Okay. I would Okay, so for SCA, which is Secret Africa, I would share an example and then I'll share one for Oscar. For SCA, a recent metric that we have been working towards for a while, or a milestone more so that we have been working towards is, we've been running the community for approximately, for over 6 years now, 6 years and a couple of months. And we have grown to 18,000 African women in the continent. And for us, another milestone, a couple of milestones. First milestone was, training 1,000 women. Second milestone was crossing 5,000 community members. Third milestone, 10,000 and all. And then now that we have, crossed that 10K milestone, 15K milestone, now we're at 18K because community is growing rapidly, and we had just come out from COVID and just like organizing in-person events. A milestone that we set for ourselves this year was having a gathering for all of our community members, just so that this milestone was also going to focus on a couple of other things around one, helping us as a core team re-understand and reassess the impact of all of the work that we have been doing for a very long time, because there's clearly a difference when you have an in-person event to when you have a virtual event, because you're able to see your community members in real time. You're able to see with your own eyes the level of impact when you see how many people are gathered. So that was a milestone for us that we recently just crossed last month, November. By the way, happy new month, everyone, if you're already in December. Yeah, so that was a milestone for us. On the Oscar part of things, the first major metric and that we had to work towards to achieve a milestone was also towards having our first ever largest open source gathering. So for us, it was a goal and it was also a metric in the sense that the goal was to have the largest African gathering or conference of African open source developers contributors. Literally everyone in open source, because we had never seen anything like that in all of Africa, and that was also a metric for us. So it was a goal slash metric or milestone. So I hope that answers that question. But like I said, in metrics for a milestone is entirely unique to different communities. It can be numbers, can be success stories, whatsoever it is. Some success cases that we've had for SCA, even recently, just day before yesterday, one of our community members relocated to Canada. She started her journey from Chico, Africa. She was a medical student and now she's a computer science undergraduate at University of Carleton. I'm correct, and she's also working at Shopify. So that is a success story for us because she was able to kick off her tech career, get a very solid background in her tech journey before moving to this other place. So these are all different success stories, metrics that people tend to look out for either when they're building their communities or when they're trying to join the community, because that also helps tell them if this community is growing or not. Welcome.